Welcome to Emerging Technology Horizons with me. I'm Mark Lewis. I'm the director of the Emerging Technologies Institute, the National Defense Industrial Association, and with me today is a very special guest, Chris Brose, who is the head of strategy for Anduril Industries. Chris is also a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Previously, he served as the director of staff for the Senate Armed Services Committee. Had a lead role in the development of significant legislation that has helped shape the Department of Defense. He was a senior policy advisor to Senator John McCain, and was also the chief speechwriter and policy advisor to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. Began his career in public service as a speechwriter for Secretary of State Colin Powell. So quite a distinguished career. Chris is also the author of The Kill Chain: Defending America in the Future of High-Tech Warfare, which is incredibly relevant to what we are attempting to accomplish at the Emerging Technologies Institute. So, Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. Let me start out by actually thanking you. You had such a critical role, as I said, in developing the National Defense Authorization Act. You helped shape science and technology in the Pentagon, and I have to tell you, I benefited from that personally. I was in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, and overseeing modernization for the department, and that wouldn't have happened without your effort. So thank you so much for that. You also have written extensively about something that actually shape, as I said, not only shape what we're doing in Emerging Technologies Institute, but which was a focus that I had in the Pentagon, which is a focus on technology modernization, and especially, I think, calling attention to the fact that we're in very, very challenging times, that we have peer competitors who've invested significantly. They're focused on catching up, particularly China in the Pacific, and I'm wondering if we could start off by talking a little bit about that. What do you see are our biggest threats, and let's talk about, are there steps that we can take to approach those?
Yeah, no, and thanks for the kind words. I mean, it was a lot of effort on the part of a lot of people, but, I think it was the right thing to do, still believe it was the right thing to do. And, I think there's still a lot more work to go as far as, kind of hammering out those reforms, as I know you'd agree, but all good progress, and appreciate all of your good efforts in leading it. Where are we? I think, as you kind of underscored, I think the concern that really underpins the book, and really the reason I wrote it, was just as I was playing my role over in the Senate, was just becoming increasingly concerned that the United States' military technological advantage was eroding, that we were being, kind of rapidly closed on by a near peer adversary. So what I would consider to be larger, kind of more significant than a great power, but a near peer competitor that was actually beginning to emerge. Or sort of develop sort of conditions of parity with the United States in certain areas of technology, increasingly in areas of sort of economic influence. And if linear projections hold, could achieve, sort of parity across the board, and then possibly surpass us in areas. And I think, underscoring all of that is, the kind of the reality that we haven't really dealt with that as the United States in, arguably a generation, probably more than a generation. And if you actually look at sort of the amount of power that China is amassing on the world stage, as a near peer competitor with real parity, you really have to go back to like the 19th century to find something, competitor or group of competitors that has that amount of influence vis-a-vis the United States. So you kind of put all of that together, and yeah, my concern was just that we were in an increasingly competitive environment that we were not sort of fully prepared for. That was not the world that we had become accustomed to. We had become accustomed to being kind of laps ahead of the competition, militarily, technologically, economically. And that underscoring all of this was just, a competitive mindset that we needed to develop or redevelop in order to really recognize the challenge we were facing and the urgency that we had to, kind of approach it with. And this is, again, a kind of comprehensive challenge. I was looking kind of more narrowly at the military dimensions of this, and I think kind of the main problem, as I was seeing, was just kind of the erosion of, our ability to deter conventional conflict, because we had an adversary that wasn't playing the same game as us, but was kind of modernizing and building up its own military forces to fundamentally call into question all of the enabling technologies, capabilities, and sort of underlying assumptions on which America has projected military power for a decade, a couple of decades, a few decades. And again, this was something that we had largely come to take for granted, that things like access to space and logistics, information intelligence, command and control, the electromagnetic spectrum, all of these were sort of things that would always be there for us, that we could always rely upon. And they were consciously developing strategies and sort of modernized military capabilities to sort of degrade all of those underlying capabilities and assumptions and fundamentally kind of take them away from us.
Absolutely spot on. I used to point out that, I still point out that, the rest of the world has had now almost an entire generation to study the way we have prosecuted war, Iraq and Afghanistan. They saw the way we use precision guided munitions. They saw the way we use space. They saw the way we introduced stealth technologies, and they've had a lot of time to study our playbook and figure out how we do things. Right. And I think you're absolutely spot on. You early on in the kill chain, you make a point that I found absolutely eye-opening, which is that every time we did a war game, we lost. It was sobering, and of course, war games have a certain artificiality to them. And but having said that, it was really quite a wake-up call. Which are the technology areas that you're most concerned about?
Most concerned about from the standpoint of what our competitors are fielding, I think, is really what they've been focused on now for 20, 25 years. China first and foremost, kind of most of all, but to a lesser extent, right? Russia, Iran, and others, is the ability to marry large quantities of sensors for forward reconnaissance of various different kinds, with sort of large quantities of increasingly lower cost and highly precise, accurate, and lethal fires. So in the book, I kind of refer back to what the Soviet Union was referring to as the reconnaissance strike complex. That I think is ultimately what our competitors have been working to build, really as a means of kind of degrading and denying, the foundations of American power projection, all of the large platforms that we have traditionally used to project power. The ability to kind of overwhelm those systems with just massive quantities of low-cost fires, low cost relative to the systems that they're shooting at, right? I mean, if you look at a DF-26, kind of long-range, anti-ship ballistic missile, that's probably a $10 million weapon that could do significant damage, to a $12 billion aircraft carrier platform. I think, when you sort of then look at all of the advanced technologies that are increasingly now coming online from the standpoint of artificial intelligence and machine learning, the sort of ubiquity of sensors, whether it's sensors that are in the terrestrial environment, things that we're carrying, kind of the proliferation of lower cost satellites on orbit, all of this, I think you put it together and it just takes this sort of reconnaissance strike complex to a wholly different level. In terms of the ability to automate a lot of this processing of information, sort of target detection, tracking, and then obviously the sort of overwhelming fires that you can bring to bear in this respect, both kinetic and non-kinetic. And again, it's concerning to see what a competitor like China or Russia is building. But this has also been on full display for us for a very long time, right? I mean, just recently, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, I think, underscores a lot of what this future warfare is going to look like. And I think the troubling thing for the United States is sort of putting ourselves into the position of, those who are on the receiving end, of what these types of capabilities can deliver. And I think it's pretty sobering. And war games aren't perfect, and they're certainly not real life. But a lot of times they're kind of the closest we can get to figuring out how to assess ourselves, our level of readiness for future conflict, future competition. And again, we shouldn't read too much into it, but when it keeps coming up red and suggesting over and over again that, the same things aren't working, I think it's a learning opportunity. And that was all I was trying to point out with that opening, opening vignette.
Yeah, no. And I agree. I couldn't agree with you more. It certainly is a learning opportunity and sobering and a chance to test out or understand how our systems are failing. I especially appreciate your point about holding our large platforms at risk. You make the point about the aircraft carrier. Actually, if I could, I might even argue that $12 billion doesn't even begin to cover it, because it's 12 plus billion but that's just for the aircraft carrier. And then you've got the airplanes on board, you've got 4,000 plus sailors, you've got the support ships that support the aircraft carrier. Same with, air bases. And, it's the Chinese seem to have figured out that they no longer need a world-class Navy to fight off our world-class Navy or a world-class Air Force to fight off our world-class Air Force. They can do it with other means, use technology means. If a $10 million missile holds almost $25 billion worth of aircraft carrier and support at risk, that's quite an exchange. So absolutely.
Yeah. And just to add to that, I think, the concern is that they are building those capabilities, but they're also on top of that building world-class Navy and world-class,
exactly. Yes.
capabilities, yeah. Right? I mean, as you would know, and I think,
yeah.
Again, I think the thing to underscore and really sort of the theme of the book, right, is that, it is the entirety of the kill chain that matters, right? And you can't hit targets that you can't find, you can't track. I take all of that. I think the concern that I see when I look at sort of our traditional force, the force that we've been building, the sort of, kind of smaller numbers of larger, exquisite platforms, expensive platforms, is just that we're playing a losing game in this. There's going to be a lot that we can do to evade detection, kind of defend those systems. But ultimately, you just end up in a numbers game, where a competitor can field so many sensors, so many fires at such lower cost that it just becomes, right, cost prohibitive to operate and try to defend those types of systems.
Yeah, again, I couldn't agree more. I was just involved in a war game exercise, a tabletop exercise. And at the end of the day, it was decided by the depth of the magazine.
Yep.
When you run out of weaponry, when you run out of missiles and bombs, you're done. You're out of Schlitz. And that was another one where the blue team lost. By the way, that was yet another example for exactly that reason. So, we know that China is investing, heavily across the board in things like artificial intelligence, hypersonics, the area that I've spent most of my life in, space certainly. We know that China has a very different ethical construct surrounding their weapons. I mean, we spent a lot of time in the Pentagon thinking through the ethical limits of how we would use artificial intelligence systems. You've written extensively also about unmanned systems. What's your sense there? Are we at risk of being totally outclassed by a peer competitor that doesn't have the same restrictions that we would put in place?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a risk, and it's something that we need to sort of acknowledge honestly and candidly, that if you have a competitor that doesn't share the same values that we do, which unfortunately in this case we have, there will be a willingness on their part to do things ethically that we would not do and won't do, that could very well generate military advantage or competitive advantage for them. And, I think when you look at our competitors, right, I mean, many of their sort of governance and sort of social models are resting on, a fundamental mistrust and willingness to empower their own people. So it shouldn't come as a huge shock that they would not be willing to, or that they would be willing to turn a lot of these kinds of military decisions, kind of life and death decisions, over to intelligent machines rather than keep them in the hands of humans. And that may very well generate advantage for them. And that's something that we're just going to have to contend with, because we're not going to win a race to the bottom, nor should we, seek to run it. What I would say, I think, is, from our own perspective, the thing that I worry almost more about is our own sort of unwillingness and sort of sense of urgency to begin building. We have to be the, kind of leading the world in the building and developing of these technologies, because I think that's where all of these hard questions are going to get asked and answered and resolved. It's through actual engineering decisions. It's through actual kind of development decisions. And at the end of the day, it's the countries or powers that have developed these technologies, that are really leading the world in the development of these technologies, that are going to have the sort of big seat at the table to determine the norms and values and laws and policies internationally that are really going to shape how these technologies are used and governed and what they're not used for. And I think that if the United States kind of takes itself out of the game in that regard, through kind of an abundance of caution and kind of a paralysis of, how we're going to begin to think about these questions, we're going to end up fundamentally disadvantaged with no opportunity to really shape kind of the emerging regime of how to think about the use and sort of lack of use or unwillingness to use these technologies for certain things, and really cede all of that to competitors who, again, don't share our values, who are already using these technologies for, kind of pervasive, intrusive, surveillance of their societies, kind of enhancement of crony capitalism, kind of, regional nefarious political influence, and many other things, oppression of minority rights. And if we want to lead the world in the governance of these technologies, we also have to lead the world in the development and deployment of these technologies, doing it all with an ethical mindset, the sort of values and morals that we bring to this, but nonetheless, kind of really making sure that we're out there building and developing these types of technologies.
So I think at one point in the kill chain, you make the point that it's not a lack of money per se; it's a lack of imagination. I think I think I'm paraphrasing.
No, you're exactly right. I mean, when I look at the United States right now, I think that if you were to sort of look at decision makers in Moscow or Beijing, kind of honestly assessing themselves, right? I think many of them, despite all of our challenges, many of them would probably change places with us every day of the week and twice on Sunday. Systemically, we have so much as a country going for us. We have all of the money we need to do this, right? Both in government and out of government. We have phenomenal human capital, human talent, both in government and out of government. And we have world-leading technology, right? The problem is so often that we don't create the incentives and we don't actually, enable all of that goodness to really flourish at its highest level. And we fundamentally just get in our own way and block our own kicks through, a political and bureaucratic process and system that is just not optimized for competing and winning the race that we're now in.
Yeah, no, I'll point out that their students still want to come study here. It's our they want to, and the vast majority, for example, of students from China who come to the United States actually want to stay in the United States after they come here. They want especially in the STEM disciplines. They see an open, free society where innovation is encouraged. I worry about a time when our students would rather go there than their students would rather come here. Actually, students from around the world should, coming here is, I think, proof of the strength of our system. And of course, I also argue one of our advantages is our strong alliances. Our alliances built on shared values, common goals. I think it's still safe to say that China doesn't have that. The alliances are based on economics. But okay, so you laid out the challenges, and I think very articulately. This is a tall order, but how do we start to fix this? How do we work to solve this problem? And of course, I think we're in a race. We're absolutely in a race. How do we do this quickly?
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and I think that's why, first and foremost, the sort of sine qua non here is, unless we have that competitive mindset and that sort of imagination to be able to realize that if we don't compete effectively and really start to get our own house in order, we're going to lose our competitive advantage. We're going to lose our sort of standing and position of influence, not in 25 years, but in the very near future. So that's the thing that I think first and foremost we have to cultivate, is this kind of competitive mindset and that sort of fatalistic imagination that we actually could lose things that we have too long taken for granted. I think at a more specific level, again, sort of looking inside of the defense enterprise, putting aside kind of economic issues and sort of other types of broader issues. I think the biggest problem that we have is that, for really over a generation now, we have built up a defense enterprise that's almost become impervious to disruption. The real problem I think that we're facing in America and American national defense is disruption. We are being systematically disrupted by competitors, and we're being disrupted by advanced technologies, the development of technologies, many of which are happening outside of the defense enterprise. So the real question becomes, with these external disruptions occurring to us, how do we disrupt ourselves in order to adapt and get ahead? And I think, a lot of times we tend to focus on technology, we tend to focus on the acquisition system. And I guess really my put on it is it is a bigger problem. The problem is really sort of the ways in which we think about the future modernization, operational concepts, technology, all of it together from requirements to programs to budgets to acquisition. We have again sort of built up this system that's kind of predicated on the ability of kind of average Americans to predict the future on like ludicrously unrealistic timelines, where they're going to sit down in the Pentagon today and they're going to develop requirements for weapon systems that they're going to field in 2032. And you kind of unpack this in a common sense way to average Americans, and it's just it's bananas. There are certain things that that may have to occur on those timelines, the sort of big capital intensive, sort of more industrial age military systems. But so much of I think what we're going to need for the future, from the standpoint of technology, doctrine, ideas, just needs to be developed on a much faster cycle. And I think I'm a big believer, and 9 years in Congress will do this to you. I'm pretty pragmatic about the future is going to have to win inside of our current system, right? We're not going to like wave a magic wand and fundamentally change the way our politics and bureaucracy are structured. So I think really what we need to do is start picking off a couple of areas to try some pilot projects to just disrupt ourselves from top to bottom. Really thinking about ways in which we can experiment with new technologies, but more to the point, I think just kind of putting the Department of Defense and kind of the U.S. government more in the mindset that what they're seeking to do is create markets, more competitive markets of capability. The thing that is so striking to me about our defense enterprise is that it is an inherently competitive business that we're in that lacks way too much, lacks competition sort of all over the place. I think one of the things we just need to find a way to cultivate is more competition, sort of on-ramping new things faster, and just buying new capability more often. And I think this crazy thing will happen in a capitalist society where if the government, with all of its kind of buying power and sort of sole demander of national defense, says, on a more regular basis, every year, every 18 months, I'm going to buy the best versions of unmanned systems and loitering munitions and, command and control capability and all these other things that we're talking about, you're now going to start to create real sort of structural incentives for disruption. Both disruption in terms of technology, because you're not saying that, an incumbent contractor is just going to kind of rule this whole capability area for a decade, as well as I think disruption at the level of ideas and strategy and sort of operational concepts of how will we actually employ these systems together with legacy systems, right, to come up with new ways of solving these problems. And again, what I would just love to see is kind of back to that point about a competitive mindset is like, let's fight this out. May the best ideas win, may the best technologies win, and let's actually do this in the real world where we can adjudicate winners and losers, and figure out how to get the winners to scale faster. Winners in the sense of like those who are coming up with like disruptive and orthogonal approaches to problems. Our system doesn't do that. At least it doesn't come naturally. And I'd like to see us, kind of find alternative pathways to generate that type of disruption more often than not.
Would you agree that we used to be better at this? I mean, if I look back, I'm an aerospace engineer, so I look at aircraft development in the 50s and 60s, the just the sheer number of new things that we experimented with. Wars are big drivers for innovation, but I look at what we did during World War II, just the sheer number of things that we tried and tested, and they failed, and we moved on. We seem
I definitely think there's a degree to which, if you kind of look back at the early Cold War, there's sort of a sense that you have of like, oh, this was what America was like when it was serious. And I think that kind of mindset is something that we do need to get back, that kind of competitive mindset, a sense that like if we don't do the right things on the right timelines, we actually could lose. Now, what I would say, though, I think the thing that we also have to recognize is that the entire environment in which we're going to have to do this is fundamentally unlike the Cold War. Back then you had, kind of research and development was really concentrated in the U.S. government. What the U.S. government spent money on, and sort of the industrial base that it had, was where R&D was occurring. It's where advanced capabilities were being developed. And that's just not the case anymore. I mean, great things still happen inside of our defense industrial base, to be sure. But so many of these technologies that we're talking about needing to figure out how to continue to advance and then integrate into defense capabilities, defense, kind of concepts of operation. These are technologies that are being developed outside of the traditional defense industrial base. And the research and development dollars that are going into those technologies are, dwarfing many times over what the United States government is spending on research and development. And that's not going to change. We're not going to sort of put that genie back in the bottle or, kind of go back to the old way of doing things. We have to think differently now about how to create incentives, how the government can create incentives to make all of this kind of private talent, engineering talent, startup companies, investment capital work for it and align to solving its hardest national security problems. And I think that's the thing that we've been talking about for many years now, but I still don't think we've figured out how to do that. We can start lots of small pilot projects, but then way too many of them perish in the valley of death and never actually get to scale, as significant disruptive military capabilities that influence the real, the kind of the joint force or the defense enterprise. That is not something that our system has been set up to do. So I think, you're absolutely right that we've got to go back to that kind of competitive mindset, but we also have to recognize that the way this is going to happen is just fundamentally different than the way we have sort of assumed, the assumptions that, kind of underlie the system, the defense system that we've
Chris,
built.
I absolutely couldn't agree with you more. Again, in my time in the building, I saw so many examples of that. We spent a lot of time talking about that valley of death, getting things out of the lab into the hands of the warfighter, the challenges that we face. Actually, sometimes I would call it the mountain of death because we had a lot of funding for transition, but just actually getting the services to adopt things, getting past the inertia of we have a legacy system, we know how to use it, we've acquired it, we know how to sustain it, we've got the workforce, we're not ready for something new. Was almost a daily frustration. So, Chris, we're coming to the end of our conversation. I got to tell you, I think we could talk about this all day. I absolutely fascinating. Any final words or thoughts as we close out the conversation?
It's been interesting now, kind of about a little over a year since the book came out. I've found almost half of the people think that I'm like way too optimistic about the future, and like the other half of the people I talk to think that I'm just doom and gloom, cynicism, pessimism. I don't know if that means I'm doing something right or doing something wrong. Maybe. I guess
you probably got it about right.
Is that at the end of the day, I actually am optimistic, right? I mean, the problems in front of us are massive. Like the external problems that we're dealing with, as far as kind of the pace of technology. The pace that the threat is moving. Arguably, the bigger problems are the problems that we are imposing on ourselves internally. But that's ultimately why I'm an optimist, right? Is that, I think a lot of the things that we have to be successful, we actually do have. Money, people, technology. I mean, big structural things that if we didn't have any one of those things, like we'd be done. The problem is us. The problem is, kind of the political and bureaucratic kind of obstacles that we put in our way. And I guess like the reason I'm an optimist is that I feel like, problems of our own making can be problems of our unmaking. And really what this requires is sort of, at the leadership level in the executive branch and the legislative branch, outside of government, the broader sort of citizenry. We just have to recognize that, if we don't get out of our own way and start competing and start really thinking about how these kinds of decisions are going to need to be made, we will fall behind, and we will be living in a world in the very near future that is fundamentally unlike the one that we, have taken for granted and, want to live in the future. Again, to me, that's a reason for optimism, but, it's not to understate the sort of significant political and bureaucratic problems that we're going to have to solve in order to get where we need to go on the timelines that we have to do it.
Chris, again, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for all that you're doing now and all that you have done in the past. This is obviously I can't think of anything of a more important subject for us to be approaching. So thanks again.
I appreciate that. No, thanks for having me on. This is great. Thank you.